It was supposed to be another quiet night for Marcus. Working as a night clerk in a sprawling, outdated condominium in downtown Austin wasn't exactly glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most of his shifts were uneventful, logging the occasional late-night visitor, handling maintenance calls, or simply sitting in the dimly lit lobby watching the hours crawl by. The building, however, had a reputation for being eerie, especially the underground parking garage. The garage was 3 levels deep, with dim lighting and countless blind corners. The management company had promised for years to upgrade the space, better lighting, cameras, and security measures. But as far as Marcus could tell, no one had even tried. The worst part of the garage was a narrow hallway on the 3rd level. It connected the elevator to the stairwell, and there was something unsettling about how the single flickering fluorescent light in the middle cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. Residents had shared stories of strange experiences down there. Phantom footsteps, unexplained noises, even whispers. But Marcus had always brushed them off. The building was old, and old buildings had their quirks. That night, Marcus found himself thinking about those stories more than usual. A call came in around 1 a.m. Mrs. Alvarez, one of the long-term residents, claimed she saw someone lingering near the parking garage's 3rd level. She described the figure as tall and hunched, wearing a dark hoodie. Her voice trembled as she explained how the figure had vanished into the shadows when she tried to get a better look. Marcus sighed, grabbed his flashlight, and headed to the elevator. He told himself it was nothing, just someone taking a shortcut or messing around. Still, as he descended into the depths of the garage, a cold knot began to form in his stomach. When the elevator doors opened, the chill in the air hit him immediately. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in his ears, blending with the echoing emptiness of the concrete cavern. He stepped out, flashlight in hand, and scanned the area. Rows of cars stretched into the distance, their shiny surfaces reflecting the weak, uneven light. At first, everything seemed normal. He walked slowly toward the hallway, the sound of his own footsteps bouncing off the walls. That's when he noticed the scratches. A car parked near the hallway door had deep, fresh marks etched into its side, as if someone had keyed it in a fit of rage. Marcus frowned and jotted the detail in his notepad. He made a mental note to report it to the building manager in the morning. He approached the narrow hallway, shining his flashlight into the shadows. The temperature seemed to drop as he stepped inside, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The flickering light overhead cast unsettling shapes along the walls. He walked further in, pausing every few steps to listen. A faint creak sounded behind him, and Marcus spun around. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called, his voice echoing slightly. There was no response. The silence stretched on, amplifying the thudding of his heart. Marcus turned back toward the parking area, ready to leave the hallway, when the door he had come through slammed shut with a deafening bang. He jumped, his flashlight wobbling in his grip. He ran to the door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic bubbled in his chest. He banged on the door, shouting for help, but his voice only bounced off the concrete walls. He reached for his radio to call the lobby, but it was dead. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he hadn't checked the batteries. He was trapped. He took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. There had to be another way out. He turned back toward the far end of the hallway, where the stairwell was supposed to be. His flashlight flickered, and he smacked it against his palm to steady the beam. He walked cautiously, his footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. Halfway down the hallway, he heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from ahead, near the stairwell door. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was making the noise wanted him to hear it. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus slowly raised his flashlight, the beam trembling as he pointed it toward the end of the hallway. For a moment, he saw nothing but the peeling paint and scuffed floor. Then something moved. A figure stepped out of the shadows, hunched and unnatural. Its face was obscured by the hood of a dark sweatshirt, but its movements were jerky, almost inhuman. Marcus's flashlight flickered again, and he saw something glinting in the figure's hand. A long, thin blade. Fear surged through him, and he stumbled backward. The figure didn't speak, didn't rush him, just stood there, swaying slightly. Then, without warning, it began to move forward, dragging the blade along the wall as it came. Marcus turned and bolted for the door, slamming his fists against it. "Help! Somebody help me!" he screamed, his voice cracking. The figure's footsteps grew louder behind him, slow and deliberate. He whirled around, pressing his back against the door. The figure was only a few feet away now, its face still hidden. Marcus raised his flashlight and aimed it directly at the hood. For a brief moment, he saw what was underneath. It wasn't a face. It was something grotesque and wrong. A gaping void where eyes and a mouth should have been. Marcus screamed and hurled the flashlight at the figure. It struck with a dull thud, but the creature didn't react. It kept moving forward, its blade scraping against the doorframe now. In a last-ditch effort, Marcus ducked and darted past the figure, running full speed toward the stairwell. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He burst through the stairwell door and took the stairs two at a time, his legs burning with the effort. He didn't stop until he reached the lobby, slamming the stairwell door shut behind him. When he finally calmed down enough to explain what had happened, his manager didn't believe him. The security cameras in the garage hadn't picked up anything unusual, and the scratches on the car were written off as vandalism. Marcus quit the job the next day, unable to shake the memory of what he had seen. To this day, he avoids parking garages, especially late at night. Sometimes, when he closes his eyes, he can still hear the sound of that blade scraping against the wall. During the summer of last year, I decided to take a break from college. I was disillusioned with my classes and needed some time to figure out my next steps. To make some extra money, I applied for a job at a gas station near campus. It wasn't my first choice, but they hired me on the spot, which felt both convenient and a little odd. There was one catch. They only needed someone for the night shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. My already erratic sleep schedule made me hesitant, but I figured I'd give it a shot. For the most part, the job wasn't bad. The early part of the shift was usually busy, and the foot traffic kept me engaged. After midnight, however, things slowed down dramatically, giving me time to clean, restock, and occasionally relax. Of course, there were always a few sketchy encounters. Drunk customers, strange passers-by, and the occasional heated argument weren't uncommon. I had grown accustomed to handling those situations, but there was one night that went far beyond anything I had experienced. It was a quiet Thursday night, well past midnight. My coworker had left shortly after 12 a.m., leaving me alone to run the store. The hours crawled by uneventfully, and I found myself staring at the clock, counting the minutes until my shift ended. At around 2 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, signaling a new customer. The man who walked in immediately set me on edge. He was tall, with a shaved head, tattoos covering his arms and neck, and a sour expression etched across his face. His eyes darted around the store as if assessing every corner. He parked his battered, lifted pickup truck in the handicapped spot right outside, which told me all I needed to know about his attitude. I greeted him, trying to sound casual, but he didn't respond. He wandered the aisles aimlessly, occasionally glancing in my direction. My unease grew with every passing second. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate and predatory, that made me want to lock the door and hide in the back room. Finally, he approached the counter with a case of beer. As I scanned it, I noticed the clock, 2:01 a.m. My county had a strict law prohibiting alcohol sales between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., and I knew I couldn't sell it to him. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my tone polite. "It's past 2 o'clock. I can't sell you this." His expression darkened immediately. "What the hell do you mean?" he snapped, leaning closer to the counter. "It's the law," I explained. "I can't sell alcohol after 2 a.m. He scoffed, shaking his head. "That's a stupid law. It's a free country. Just ring it up." I tried to hold my ground, but my voice wavered. "I'm sorry, I can't." His face twisted into a sneer. "You're just some spineless pawn for your boss, aren't you? Can't even make a decision on your own." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment and anger. "If you're going to be disrespectful, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," I said, though my voice betrayed my fear. His demeanor shifted again, and he forced a smile. "Look, kid, it's not a big deal. I walked in here before 2 o'clock. Just bend the rules a little. No one's gonna care." I hesitated. Technically, he had a point, but something told me this wasn't about the beer anymore. He wanted to see how far he could push me. Against my better judgment, I relented, rang up the beer, and bagged it for him. "See? That wasn't so hard," he said with a grin, grabbing the bag and heading for the door. I exhaled deeply, relieved to see him go, but my relief was short-lived. Instead of leaving, he propped open the tailgate of his truck, cracked open a can of beer, and sat there drinking. I stared at him through the window, my unease growing. A few minutes later, another truck pulled up next to his, and 2 men with similar appearances climbed out. They joined him, laughing and lighting cigarettes. I knew I had to do something. Store policy prohibited loitering, especially drinking on the premises. I stepped to the edge of the counter, contemplating whether I should confront them. Before I could decide, a third vehicle, a large SUV, pulled up. 2 more men stepped out, both heavily tattooed. Now there were 5 of them gathered outside. They kept glancing at the store, smirking as if daring me to come outside. My heart pounded as I weighed my options. I didn't want to provoke them, but I also didn't want to risk letting them stay. Before I could summon the courage to act, the first man returned to the store. He staggered up to the counter, drunker than before, and slammed another case of beer onto it. "You're gonna sell this to me," he said, his voice low and threatening. I opened my mouth to object, but he cut me off. "You don't want to disappoint me and my friends, do you?" The veiled threat sent a chill down my spine. I nodded silently, rang up the beer, and handed it over without protest. He left again, and the group outside erupted in cheers as they opened the new case. By now, they were tossing empty cans into the parking lot and making a mess. I felt completely trapped. If I confronted them, I'd risk angering them. If I ignored them, I'd be held accountable for the damage. Finally, I made a decision. I walked to the door, locked it, and flipped off the open sign. Then I retreated to the back office and called the police. As I explained the situation, I glanced at the security monitor, which showed the group pacing near the door, visibly irritated. Several minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the lot. The officers stepped out, and a tense confrontation ensued. I couldn't hear the exchange, but the men shouted and gestured angrily. Eventually, they climbed into their vehicles and sped off. The officer stayed until the lot was clear. Before he left, I stepped outside and asked if he could stick around while I cleaned up. He agreed, and I hurriedly picked up the scattered beer cans and trash. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the men might come back. The next day, I quit the job. No paycheck was worth the terror of another night like that. Even now, I sometimes worry about running into one of them around town. I don't know what they were truly capable of, but I'm not eager to find out. A few years ago, I worked as a barista at a small, locally owned coffee shop. It wasn't just a cafe, it was a popular spot for open mic nights, local artists, and small-time gigs. The place had its charm, but working there wasn't exactly glamorous. I had taken the job to support myself while in school, and while I didn't love it, it paid the bills. The shop had an unusual schedule. While most of its business came from evening events, it stayed open 24/7 from Thursday through Sunday, working the graveyard shift. Overnight hours when the city felt deserted was something most employees hated. Not me. I didn't mind the lower tips or the quiet hours. What I hated, though, was the isolation. I was often the only one in the shop, surrounded by nothing but dim streetlights and shadows. It became a habit of mine to invite a friend to hang out with me during these shifts. Having someone around made me feel safer, especially since we were the only place open for miles. My most reliable companion during these nights was Nick. He wasn't just a friend. He was a close confidant. We'd known each other for years, and he was one of the few people I trusted completely. Nick had a laid-back personality and loved working on his photography projects while I served the occasional late-night customer. Sometimes, I'd sneak him a beer or a pastry, and we'd chat when the shop was empty. Our friendship had always been platonic, and I thought I knew him well. But as I would soon learn, People aren't always who they seem. It was a slow Saturday night in the summer of 2019, and I was working the final overnight shift of the weekend. Nick hadn't been around for the past 2 nights because he'd gone to a family wedding, so I'd asked another friend to fill in and keep me company. Unfortunately, they bailed on me that night, leaving me alone for the first time in weeks. By 3 a.m., I had only made about $10 in tips, but I was relieved it had been a quiet night. Most of the customers were regulars or harmless night owls. As I cleaned up behind the counter, I felt grateful for the peace. But peace never lasts long, does it? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure pass by the front window. I froze, waiting for them to come in, but no one appeared. A full minute passed. I checked the back door. Nothing. Assuming they'd changed their mind or were just passing by, I shrugged it off and went back to work. A few minutes later, I heard the bell above the door chime. Finally, someone had come in. Be right there. I called out as I filled up the mop bucket in the back. But when I returned to the front, the shop was empty. I frowned and looked around. The bathrooms were the only other place they could be, so I assumed whoever it was had gone straight there. The light was on in the men's room, and the door was closed. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. I tried to ignore it and started mopping behind the counter. A few minutes later, the bathroom door opened and Nick walked out. Relief washed over me. "Nick," I exclaimed. "What are you doing here? I thought you were at a wedding." He grinned, his usual relaxed self. "I just got back and thought I'd swing by and say hi." I was genuinely happy to see him. After 2 nights alone, having him around felt like a blessing. "Grab whatever you want," I said, gesturing toward the pastries and drinks. "It's on the house." He nodded, but instead of heading to the counter, he leaned against the wall, watching me. It wasn't unusual. Nick often hung back while I worked, but there was something different about his demeanor. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt uneasy. As I pulled a shot of espresso, I glanced at him again. His face had changed. The easygoing smile was gone, replaced by something darker. His eyes were sharp, almost predatory, and he was standing unnervingly still. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Then, with a grin that made my stomach churn, he reached behind his back and pulled out a knife. "I've waited long enough," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're not going to stop me tonight." My heart dropped. "Nick," I stammered, stepping back. "What are you doing?" "We're friends." He laughed, taking a slow step forward. "Friends? You think that's all this is? No one's going to believe you. The cameras aren't even on. How do you not know that?" I felt the blood drain from my face. He was right. The security cameras were just for show. Management had never bothered to install real ones. I was completely alone, with no one to call for help. Nick kept moving closer, forcing me to retreat behind the counter. "Your boss already thinks we hook up every night," he sneered. "No one will question this." I panicked, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My hands fumbled against the counter, but all I could feel were coffee cups and napkins. He was too close now, his knife glinting in the fluorescent light. "Don't do this," I begged. "Please, Nick, think about what you're doing." "Shut up," he snapped, lunging toward me. In a blind panic, my hand closed around something heavy, the panini press. Without thinking, I ripped it from the counter and swung it as hard as I could. The corner of the press connected with the side of his head, and he stumbled backward, crashing to the floor. But he wasn't done. As I tried to run past him, he grabbed my arm, slicing it with the knife. Pain shot through me, but adrenaline kept me moving. I shoved him away and bolted for the back door, clutching my bleeding arm. I burst into the alley, locking myself in my car. My hands trembled as I called 911, barely able to get the words out. As I spoke to the operator, I saw Nick emerge from the back door. He was furious, slamming his fists against my car windows. When he realized he couldn't get in, he climbed into his own car, which he had parked behind mine, blocking me in. For several minutes, he tried to ram my car, his headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. Finally, sirens wailed in the distance, and he sped off just before the police arrived. The officers took my statement and treated my wound. They assured me they'd find him, but I doubted it. Nick knew the area too well, and he had a head start. Sure enough, he disappeared after posting bail and was never seen again. I kept working at the coffee shop for a few more months, but I never felt safe again. The cameras were never fixed, and I constantly looked over my shoulder, half expecting Nick to show up. Eventually, I moved out of town, leaving the memories of that night behind. To this day, I don't know what triggered him. Maybe he had been planning it all along, or maybe something snapped in him that night. All I know is that the person I thought was my friend turned out to be a monster, and it's a lesson I'll never forget. A few years ago, I worked as a waiter at a 24-hour diner in a small, rural town. It was one of those places right off the interstate where truckers and road trippers would stop for a quick bite. For most people, the town was just a brief pit stop on their way to somewhere better. For me, though, it was home. Or at least it was until I saved up enough money to leave. The diner, being the only place open around the clock, was always busiest late at night. Truck drivers, farmers, and the occasional stranded hitchhiker were our usual customers. It wasn't exactly a glamorous job, but it paid well enough during the overnight shifts, and the tips weren't bad. Plus, I worked with Carl, a gruff cook who had been there for 15 years and knew how to handle any trouble that came our way. Carl had seen it all: drunken fights, thefts, you name it. He had a knack for spotting trouble the moment it walked through the door, and I quickly learned to trust his instincts. Most nights were manageable with Carl around, but one particular shift still haunts me to this day. It was a slow night, probably around 4 a.m. The diner was quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional clatter of Carl's spatula in the kitchen. We had one customer left, a trucker nursing a cup of coffee and flipping through a weathered newspaper. The air was heavy with the smell of frying bacon and cleaning chemicals, and I was counting the minutes until my shift ended. That's when the man walked in. He didn't so much walk as stumble, lurching through the door as though he were being pushed by some invisible force. He was filthy, his clothes caked in dirt, his jacket torn, and his face streaked with grime. He clutched his right arm tightly to his chest, his hand hidden beneath the jacket as if he were shielding it from view. His eyes darted around the diner, wide and frantic, but he didn't say a word. Carl and I exchanged a glance. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. We were both used to dealing with vagrants or the occasional tweaker, but something about this man felt different. There was a tension in the air, like the diner itself was holding its breath. The man ignored the counter and the tables. Instead, he headed straight for the bathroom and slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed through the empty diner, and I couldn't help but shiver. I walked over to Carl, who was flipping pancakes on the griddle. "Does he look familiar to you?" I asked. Carl frowned, wiping his hands on his apron. "Yeah, actually, I think he was in here a couple of hours ago. Wasn't he the guy going table to table asking for a ride?" My stomach dropped. I remembered him now. He'd come in around midnight, pestering every customer for a lift out of town. When nobody agreed, we'd had to ask him to leave. He had looked desperate then, but now he looked like he was running for his life. "What do you think we should do?" I asked. Carl shrugged. "Let him be for now. If he doesn't come out soon, we'll deal with it." The minutes dragged on. The trucker finished his coffee and left, leaving the diner eerily quiet. After about 10 minutes of silence from the bathroom, I decided to check on the man. Grabbing the bathroom key, I knocked on the door loudly. "Hey, buddy, you okay in there?" I called. There was a long pause before I heard a voice, strained and panicked. "I think I'm hurt. I need a ride." His words sent a chill down my spine. Something about his tone didn't feel right. It wasn't just desperation, it was fear. Real, bone-deep fear. "Sir, if you're injured, we can call an ambulance," I offered, fumbling with the keys. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't call anyone. You have to come in and get me." I froze. His plea was so strange, so unsettling, that for a moment I didn't know what to do. Carl called out from the kitchen. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky. "He says he's hurt, but doesn't want an ambulance." Carl sighed and walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. "Open the door. Let's see what we're dealing with." I nodded, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The bathroom was empty. I blinked, stepping inside to make sure I wasn't imagining things. There was no one there. No man, no sign of blood, nothing. The bathroom was spotless, as if it had just been cleaned. Even the smell of bleach lingered in the air. "What the hell?" Carl said, peering over my shoulder. He stormed into the room, checking the stalls and the corners. "You're telling me a guy just vanished?" I don't know," I stammered. "He was here, I swear." Carl looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But before he could say anything, we both saw something out of the corner of our eyes. The man was outside, standing by the window, staring at us. His face was worse than before. Blood trickled down from a gash on his forehead, and one of his eyes was swollen shut. His lips were split, revealing teeth that were cracked and missing. His right arm was still tucked under his jacket, but now I could see something dripping from it, something dark and sticky. Carl and I didn't move. We just stood there, frozen, as the man stared at us. Then, slowly, he turned and limped away, disappearing around the corner of the building. We didn't have long to process what we'd just seen. A loud crash came from the back of the diner, jolting us both into action. We ran to the kitchen, where the sound had come from the walk-in freezer. Inside, boxes of frozen patties were scattered across the floor, and the man was standing in the middle of the mess. He had removed his jacket, revealing his right arm, or what was left of it. His wrist was bent at an impossible angle, the hand dangling by a thread of skin. The flesh was raw and bloody, and the sight of it made me gag. The man stared at us, his expression a mix of rage and terror. Then, without warning, he bolted, shoving past us and sprinting out the front door. Carl locked the doors behind him and flipped off the lights, plunging the diner into darkness. We spent the rest of the night in the back office, too afraid to come out. When the morning crew arrived, we told them everything, but they just looked at us like we were crazy. Later that day, we heard the news. A man had been killed in a hit-and-run at the off-ramp just outside of town. His body had been lying there for hours, undiscovered until daylight. The details were grisly. His body mangled beyond recognition, except for one thing. His hand, sticking straight up in a thumbs-up position, as if he had been hitchhiking when it happened. Carl and I never spoke about that night again, but every time I drive past that off-ramp, I think about the man. Was it his ghost? Or was it something worse? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. I've always been a night owl, so when I graduated high school, taking a job as a nighttime janitor for the local school district seemed like the perfect fit. I didn't mind working alone, and the thought of not having to interact with people all day was a big plus. Most of my shifts were quiet, with nothing more to deal with than the messes left by students during the day. The school I worked at was a large K-12 building. It was split into separate areas for elementary, middle, and high school students, which meant it took an entire 8-hour shift to clean the place. Luckily, I wasn't completely alone. Another janitor worked the opposite end of the school, and we'd usually meet in the middle by the end of the night. Still, we hardly ever interacted, which I appreciated. The silence and solitude made the job perfect for someone like me. That is, until one particular night, the night after Halloween. The shift started off like any other. I arrived at 8 p.m., clocked in, and grabbed my supplies. The school was eerily quiet as usual, the hallways dimly lit by the emergency lights. Most of the teachers and staff left before I even started, so by the time I got there, the place was usually empty. For the first hour, things went smoothly. I was mopping the hallway near the gym when I started hearing strange noises. It was faint at first, just a low, echoing sound I couldn't quite place. I paused my music and stood still, listening. It sounded like footsteps, or maybe laughter. I couldn't be sure. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to work. A little while later, I took a break to change the mop water. When I returned to the hallway, I noticed something odd. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier was knocked over. It didn't seem like a big deal, so I picked it up and started remopping the area. That's when I saw them. Tiny, wet footprints. They led from the middle of the hallway toward the stairs at the far end. The sight of them made me uneasy. I was sure I hadn't seen anyone else in the building. My coworker was working on the other side of the school, and I hadn't heard anyone come through. Still, the footprints were there, clear as day, and they were definitely fresh. I decided to follow them. The footprints led up the stairs to the second floor, but as soon as I reached the landing, they disappeared. The floors up here were dry, and there were no signs of anyone. I stood there for a moment, scanning the hallway, but everything was still and quiet. Shaking my head, I headed back downstairs, convincing myself it was just some strange fluke. About an hour later, I heard a loud crash from the hallway I had just cleaned. Heart pounding, I rushed back to find my mop bucket tipped over, the soapy water spreading in a massive puddle across the floor. I cursed under my breath and grabbed a dry mop from the supply closet, muttering about how much extra work this would be. It took me nearly half an hour to clean up the mess, and by the time I finished, I was fuming. Frustrated and on edge, I decided to confront my coworker. If she was playing some kind of prank on me, I wanted it to stop. I marched across the school to her section and found her mopping near the library. "Have you been messing with me?" I demanded. She looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "The footprints, the tipped-over bucket," I said. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." Her confused expression didn't change. "I've been here the whole time. I don't even know what you're talking about." Something about the way she said it made me believe her. Feeling foolish, I muttered an apology and walked away. But the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The rest of the night was quiet until about 11 p.m., when the entire school was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered once before shutting off completely, leaving me in pitch black for a few seconds. Then the emergency lights kicked on, bathing the hallways in an eerie red glow. At first, I thought it was just a power outage, but as I made my way toward the electrical room to reset the breakers, I heard something that froze me in my tracks, a scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was the kind of scream that sends chills down your spine, full of raw terror and desperation. It echoed through the empty hallways, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. My first thought was my coworker. Had something happened to her? I forced myself to keep moving, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the electrical room, the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting to see someone, or something, waiting for me inside. Instead, the room was empty. The breakers were all in their proper positions. There was no reason for the power to have gone out. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, when the door suddenly slammed shut behind me. Panic set in. I yanked the door open and bolted down the hallway, no longer caring about the lights or the scream. My only thought was to find my coworker and get the hell out of there. I found her cleaning near the bathrooms on the first floor. Her mop bucket was parked in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere in sight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I approached the bucket cautiously, my eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. Just as I reached it, I heard the sound of faint laughter. It was high-pitched and childlike, echoing from somewhere down the hall. My blood ran cold. Grabbing the handle of the mop like a weapon, I turned toward the sound. "Who's there?" I demanded. The laughter stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, out of nowhere, someone whispered in my ear, "Hello." I spun around, swinging the mop wildly. It hit something solid, and I heard a grunt of pain as whoever it was stumbled backward. I squinted in the dim light and saw a figure crouched on the ground, clutching their chest. It wasn't a ghost or some otherworldly creature. It was a student, a scrawny ninth grader, tears streaming down his face as he gasped for breath. My shock quickly turned to anger as I realized what was happening. "What the hell are you doing here?" I snapped. Over the next few days, I learned the full story. It wasn't just one student, it was three. Two ninth-grade twins and their younger brother had decided to keep the Halloween spirit alive by sneaking into the school and pranking the night crew. They'd hidden in an unused locker until after everyone left, then spent the night wreaking havoc. Their footprints, the mop bucket, even the scream. It had all been part of their elaborate plan to scare us. They managed to avoid expulsion, probably by crying their way out of it. Meanwhile, I was transferred to another school, which suited me just fine. To this day, I don't know how they managed to pull off some of their tricks, but one thing's for sure. I'll never look at Halloween the same way again.